For as intensely patriotic as a lot of Americans are, I've always been astonished that the American Revolution as a time period is so underutilized in film. It's literally the defining moment of our country, and yet, off the top of my head, I can think of little more than a half dozen movies and TV shows centered around it that have been produced within the last 20 odd years. Of that number, only about half have achieved widespread recognition, and less than half of that number are anywhere close to the realm of what I would consider to be good. For years now, I have been begging for the American Revolution, or really just the late 18th century in general, to get some honest-to-goodness on-screen representation. And now, as we enter 2024, it seems I may finally be getting my wish, which you would think would make me happy, but I have concerns. You see, a few weeks back, one of my friends shared with me a trailer for an upcoming miniseries simply called Luso, the series, which allegedly tells the story of one Peter Francisco, a Portuguese man who fought for the Continental Army during the American Revolution. The trailer isn't very long, a mere 40 seconds, but it immediately set off a bunch of red flags for me. Naturally, the first thing that I couldn't help but notice was that from a material culture standpoint, the show just doesn't look very good. The costumes appear to be very cheaply made, the main character is wearing a leather waistcoat, and one of the very first redcoat extras we see in the trailer has a full-on goatee. There are a ton of little inaccuracies like this just in these 40 seconds that I could easily spend far too long picking apart if I wanted to, but I'm not going to because ultimately these things are not what bothers me the most about the trailer. While, yes, they do take me out of the moment, I'm far more concerned about the way that this show is going to be portraying the figure of Peter Francisco. When the poster for the series refers to Francisco's tale as the American Braveheart story, that should tell you something. And as anyone who's familiar with the historical accuracy of Braveheart will tell you, that's not really a selling point. We also already have the American Braveheart story in the form of The Patriot, and that also sucks. By now you're probably wanting a bit more information on who exactly this Peter Francisco character is, or rather was. Peter Francisco was a real person who did indeed fight for the Continental Army, and his service record alone is impressive enough without need for embellishment. He enlisted in the 10th Virginia Regiment in 1776 and fought at many famous engagements including the battles of Monmouth, Stony Point, Camden, and Guilford Courthouse, and he was wounded several times in service of the American cause. He is also said to have been impressive in stature, and there are artifacts with provenance to him that support this, including a waistcoat belonging to him in the collections of the Virginia Historical Society, and a shoe belonging to him in the collections of the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park. The shoe is equivalent in size to a modern men's 10.5 size. In addition, he seems to have been a competent soldier. John Nichols described his actions during the war as being equal to 6 or 8 of the best soldiers of the army. However, the true extent of his contributions to the war service is a matter of some debate. Perhaps in part due to his large stature, he has become a sort of mythic figure, a Revolutionary War Paul Bunyan, if you will. He has been referred to as the Virginia Giant, the American Hercules, and, in the words of the American Battlefield Trust, the Incredible Hulk of the American Revolution. Legend holds that he wielded a 6-foot broadsword, and that he was the second man to enter the British earthworks at Stony Point, where he was wounded in the abdomen, but continued to fight, capturing the British colors in the process. At Camden, he is said to have rescued a 1,100-pound cannon from being mired in the mud by hoisting it over his shoulder. And at Guilford Courthouse, he is said to have personally killed 11 redcoats with his broadsword. A quote, often attributed to George Washington himself, alleges that without Francisco's contributions, we would have lost 2 crucial battles, perhaps the war, and with it, our freedom. If this all sounds a little too fanciful to be true, it's because most of it likely isn't. That aforementioned quote from George Washington, for example, appears often in popular histories, but it is never linked to a primary source. There is no evidence of Washington ever having spoken these words. In fact, there is no evidence to suggest that Francisco ever caught Washington's attention at all. Researchers at the Mount Vernon Library have never been able to find any mention of Francisco in any of Washington's correspondence. There is no evidence to suggest that he wielded a 6-foot broadsword, or that he was the second man to enter the works at Stony Point, or that he captured the British colors. A French volunteer by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Francois de Fleury recorded the names of the first 5 men to enter the works at Stony Point, and none of them were Francisco. Notably, it is also de Fleury who is credited with the capturing of the colors, and not Francisco. The claim that he personally felled 11 British troops at Guilford Courthouse is also likely false, and this is supported by Francisco's own pension application from 1820, in which he claims to have only personally slain 2 men, and only upping the count when applying for a pension again in 1829, and even then, only up to 4. As far as the other tales go, of Francisco supposedly lifting a 1,000-pound cannon single-handedly, I would hope I don't need to elaborate further to tell you why that's nonsense, and you shouldn't be surprised to hear that, much like the supposed Washington quotation, there is no primary source documentation to support this event ever having occurred either. The Francisco tale is steeped in myth, and this is my main source of concern for Luso the series. Judging from what I have seen in the trailer, it seems to be far more focused on the myth rather than the man. There are several shots of the actor portraying Francisco brandishing his fantasy broadsword, and that dubious quotation attributed to Washington is even used as the tagline for the trailer.
Without him, we would have lost 2 crucial battles, perhaps the war, and with it, our freedom.
In one clip, Francisco even appears to punch a redcoat to death with his bare hands, shortly before delivering a cringy action hero line.
Scratch my good arm.
It's silly. And if that was the intention, then fine. But based on some of the posts that the showrunners have made on social media, it seems that was not the intention. Quite the opposite. This show is being presented as fact. One post from the show's Facebook page claims that 83% of Americans don't understand the basics of the American Revolution, and that the show aims to reverse that. Where still another post leads with, "We live in a day and age where history is being rewritten, and men are confused about their gender. Our children need a real male role model and to understand America's history. Luso the series will be just what our culture needs today." Even setting aside the casual transphobia, I balk at the idea that the show will tell the true history of the American Revolution. Everything shown in the trailer is complete fantasy, and if there's one thing I cannot abide, it is fantasy that attempts to pass itself off as history. The American Revolution has already had more than enough of that, especially with Roland Emmerich's The Patriot, which continues to do untold damage to the public perception of the revolution to this day. You simply cannot claim that your show promotes understanding of American history when your principal character is portrayed like a one-man army running around the battlefield with no sense of self-preservation and felling redcoats left and right with his bare hands like so many stormtroopers. It not only does a disservice to the professionalism of the British Army, this is the same British Army that the trailer lauds as being the world's strongest, mind you. It also does an incredible disservice to the memory of the American soldiers who fought against them and struggled for 8 years to gain their independence. It makes the entire experience seem trivial. But then again, that's not really the point of the show, is it? No, it's really all about giving a strong, hypermasculine role model to the confused youths of today. No more of this gender crap. Get out there and punch a redcoat to death and catch cannonballs with your bare hands. Now that's a man. It's knee-jerk reactionary politics in action, plain and simple. They're trying to use history like a warm blanket that they can drape themselves in and say, ah yes, the good old days when men were men. Never mind the racism and the social inequality and all of that other stuff, just focus on the man with the big sword. I can't help but think of another production from a few years back which suffered from a similar problem, Washington's Armor. While technically still in production, the pilot episode of this series has been out since 2022, but until recently it was only available to stream on the Epoch Times, a right-wing news outlet with ties to the Falun Gong, which should tell you everything you need to know about the sort of biases to expect from the production right out of the gate. I will say this for the show, it is, for the most part, unlike Luso, competently filmed, and the dialogue does have an appropriate amount of period flair. The production design, while not amazing, is at least serviceable, although there are times, especially towards the end, where you can see where the budget was starting to wear thin. Production value aside, though, the biases are nonetheless evident once you start to examine the core premise and the source that inspired the series in the first place. The show ostensibly chronicles the story of a young George Washington and his various exploits during the French and Indian War, with the core premise centering around the idea that he was never wounded in battle because a divine presence was shielding him. The director and writer of the series even goes as far as to say that George Washington was God's chosen vessel to establish a nation and become the first president of the United States. This, to me, is the first big red flag for the series. I can't help but feel that this outlook is actually reductive to the character of Washington. I mean, here I was thinking that it was Washington's own merits, his courage, resolve, and his success as a strategist that ultimately led him down the path of becoming the first president. But no, apparently it was ordained unto him by God, which sounds an awful lot like divine right. Ironic, considering that is one of the things that the American colonists were fighting to be free from. Cinematic portrayals of Washington often don't work for me because, much like Peter Francisco, he has risen to this mythical status and is presented as this beacon of righteousness. How many of us grew up hearing the story of Washington and the cherry tree, for example, and about how he couldn't tell a lie? That story is thankfully not in the series, but I can't shake the feeling that this show's portrayal of Washington is nevertheless just a little too perfect. There's this sense that to speak ill of Washington by implying that he was somehow anything less than perfect is to speak ill of America. So Washington as a character is frequently presented as a character with no flaws, which is not only dishonest to him as a person, but also makes him not very relatable as a character. In essence, he becomes an action hero in historical garb. Indeed, the only aspect of Washington's character in this series, which could be considered a character flaw in my estimation, is that he is young and therefore headstrong. Otherwise, he's a perfect gentleman. All the men want to be like him and all the women want to be with him. He's affable, a good dancer, good with kids, and a competent swordsman. All traits which, to be fair, most researchers would agree he did possess in real life. He's certainly likable, but not exactly what I would call complex. In fact, the show seems to take great care to skirt around any parts of his story which might deem to add shades of gray to his character. The scene that exemplifies this the best is a scene towards the end of the first episode, which depicts Washington's ambush on French forces led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville at the now eponymous Jumonville Glen in 1754. The skirmish which is generally credited as the action that sparked the French and Indian War. To provide some brief historical context, this was an event lasting only 15 minutes in which a small detachment of 40 Virginian soldiers and 12 Mingo natives, led by Washington, stumbled across a French encampment. Washington was determined to surround the French soldiers and discover the purpose of why they were there. But as he was getting his men into position, a shot was fired, and the situation quickly devolved, leading to the deaths of many of the French soldiers, including Jumonville. In the scene of the show, which depicts the event, Washington experiences a moment of trepidation before killing a French soldier with a pistol. But when one of his own officers is shot, Washington flies into a rage and he charges directly at the French, sword in hand, before taking a flying leap through the air and dispatching another French soldier with a bad action movie-style 360 spin move. It's, again, all rather silly. The scene then concludes with the death of Ensign Jumonville, who is depicted producing a missive which he urges Washington to read, but as he is speaking French, Washington is unable to understand him. But before anybody has a chance to explain anything, Washington's Mingo ally, the Half-King, splits Jumonville's skull open with a tomahawk. In real life, the circumstances surrounding Jumonville's death are not exactly known. It's not known, for example, whether Washington's forces or Jumonville's fired the first shots which kicked off the action. Both sides offer differing accounts. It is also unclear at what point during the skirmish Jumonville was killed, whether it was during the battle or after the French forces had surrendered. Some sources do support that it was the half-king who delivered the killing blow, while others claim that he was shot. Sources also disagree on which belligerents were responsible for the bulk of the French casualties. Some insist it was Washington's native allies, while some claim it was Washington's own Virginians who conducted most of the killing, to the point where the natives actually had to step in and stop them. French accounts also insist that Jumonville's troops were there on a diplomatic mission, while Washington insisted that Jumonville and his men were acting in a military capacity. I bring all of this up to point out that there are a lot of gray areas surrounding exactly what happened that day, but the order of events presented in the show is as follows. The French attack first, Washington retaliates, and then Jumonville is killed by the half-king. Pretty cut and dry. I find it telling that the show very deliberately goes out of its way to depict the French soldiers as being the ones to have fired the first shots, which actually seems to contradict Washington's own account of the battle. According to his diary, "We were advanced pretty near them when they discovered us, whereupon I ordered my company to fire." By having the French be the ones to fire the first shots, any attempt to examine Washington's potential culpability in the entire affair is sidestepped. The blame does not fall on him for starting the battle because he is acting in self-defense. Likewise, by having the half-king be the one to land the killing strike on Jumonville, Washington takes no responsibility for that either. Instead, all of the blame falls squarely on the natives. Not exactly good optics, in my opinion. Washington comes out of the action not only physically unscathed, but with his conscience likewise intact. It all feels a little too convenient and a little too cozy, and once again, there's that indelible sense of that warm blanket coming down again. Washington couldn't have possibly committed a war crime. No. That would be hardly becoming behavior for God's chosen vessel. And boy, do they not let you forget about the God's chosen vessel part. At every available opportunity, the show makes a point of reminding you of how miraculous it is that Washington is able to continually escape from dangerous situations without being harmed. Characters constantly remark about how he seems to have a divine hand guiding him. In one scene, a doctor character even attempts to offer a rational explanation for Washington's good fortune, and he is promptly told off.
Colonel Washington fancies the timely occasion of a shut-up Allegheny to be an act of divine providence, as opposed to the simple scientific operation of water at 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
I hold the thought of divine providence quite pleasing, kind sir.
Shut up, science bitch.
Yeah, shut up, science bitch.
There's other scenes that don't sit right with me as well. Chief among them being a scene between Lord Fairfax, a lifelong friend and mentor of Washington, and his cousin, in which it is heavily implied that Lord Fairfax intentionally placed Washington in a position to start a war with France in order to advance his own interests in the Ohio Valley.
So entrenched in his noble ideals, our young Washington. 'Tis why I did pick the boy, William.
You picked the boy.
Like a ripe apple.
For what did you pick him?
Why, for the task at hand, of course. There is no finer officer than one who is unafraid to fight alongside his men.
You speak of war, Thomas. What plot have you hatched?
It's weird and uncomfortable, and the actor playing Lord Fairfax plays the scene in an over-the-top, hand-wringing sort of way, which I can't help but feel is an intentional directing choice in order to make the characters seem unlikable. The show is based on a book titled Bulletproof Washington by David Barton, a man who is many things, but a historian he most certainly is not. What he is, however, is a Christian nationalist and right-wing activist whose works frequently revolve around the misguided notion that the United States was founded explicitly as a Christian nation, an idea that the founding fathers themselves would disagree with. Barton's works have been heavily criticized by both the left and the right. His writings have been described as highly misleading, as well as anti-gay and pseudo-history. In fact, one of his books, The Jefferson Lies, was even pulled from publication in 2012. The book was deemed the least credible history book in print by the History News Network, and even the book's own publisher admitted that basic truths were just not there. Given their association with Barton, Washington's Armor can hardly claim to be an unbiased production, yet, much like Luso, it claims to tell the untold story of a prominent historical figure, touting itself as true history in spite of having a clear agenda.
Washington's Armor is a miraculous account of a young George Washington, a providential story that's still needed today.
By joining us and making this film, you are not only going to be helping us to preserve the history, but you are going to help us to tell the truth about history and tell this untold story of young George Washington and God's divine protection over him.
It's not even inasmuch that the series is factually inaccurate. A lot of the story is lifted directly from Washington's own journals, so there's kernels of truth in there, but they are truths in service of a lie, that America was founded as a Christian nation, with Washington as the chosen vessel to bring it into existence. That's why I will never buy the excuse of, oh, it's just a movie, it doesn't have to be accurate, it's entertainment. The fact remains that there are, and always will be, people who take what they see in movies and TV at face value. That's why when shows like Luso and Washington's Armor tout themselves as true history, or when people like Ridley Scott show Napoleon blowing up the pyramids and then fire back with comments like, "Were you there?" it bothers me. There is enough anti-intellectualism in the world today without peddlers of myth muddying the waters further. I'm going to leave you today with a quote from Kevin M Cru, author of Myth America: Historians Take on the Biggest Lies About Our Past, a book that was just published at the start of this past year. A history that seeks to exalt a nation's strengths without examining its shortcomings, that values feeling good over thinking hard, that embraces simplistic celebration over complex understanding, isn't history, it's propaganda. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for sitting through it. If you did, I imagine 2/3 of you are probably gone by now. For those of you who did decide to stick around, I do appreciate it. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Leave a like and a comment down below if you enjoyed. Let me know. Check out the Patreon if you feel like it. And as always, God save the king.